Hello and welcome to the top custom Hearthstone cards of the week. First up we have Shark Thrower, 4 mana 3/2 with combo, choose a minion, summon a 3/3 shark to attack it. Getting the combo with this card is pretty important because with the additional shark, it bumps this up to 6/5 stats for only 4 mana. On top of this, the shark also has a rush-like effect, allowing you to deal 3 damage to an enemy minion. But it's actually a little bit better than rush, because with this targeting effect, you're able to get around taunt. It's also important that it's a 3/3 minion and not just an effect that deals 3 damage. Even if your opponent only has a weak minion like Firefly out on the board, you can still remove it with the combo and you'll also get great stats for only 4 mana out on the board. An interesting note is that the card doesn't specify that it needs to target just enemy minions. You could target your own Devilsaur Egg and kill it to give yourself a 5/5, 3/3, and 3/2. Definitely a unique use for this card. The downside to this type of targeting is that if your opponent doesn't have any minions and you activate this card's combo, you'll be forced to target one of your own minions. So you'd have to be careful. That's why I always put eggs in my deck. In matchups against decks like Secret Hunter and Control Mage, who sometimes don't have minions on their board, you may not be able to get this card's full value, especially not in the early game or on curve. Another negative to consider is that 4 mana for 6/5 stats is nice, but these stats are distributed between 2 minions, the Thrower at just 2 health, and the Shark, which, even if it survives, likely only has 2 or 1 health. Opponents are going to be able to pretty efficiently remove these 2 low health statted minions, whether with a cheap board clear or some low cost trading. I don't know if it would necessarily see play, but Shark Thrower has great pirate, beast, and shark flavor, and I think it's actually a better fit to the Rastakhan set than some rogue cards that were actually released. Next up is Kael'thas Sunstrider. I don't know if I'm saying that right. 7 mana, 7/5 legendary mage minion that reads, your hero power costs 10 and deals 10 damage. Now this card doesn't permanently change your hero power to become like a Pyroblast. It's just an aura effect, which means it only applies when this minion is out on the board. And so paying 7 mana to put this minion out on the board and get this effect is only so good on its own. Luckily, Hero Power Mage has some cards to help this card out. Most notably is Waterboy, which comboed with this card for only 9 mana allows you to play a Pyroblast and also get stats out on the board. If you're able to get Sunstrider out on the board for a cheaper cost, or it survives until the next turn, you can combo this with cards like Clockwork Automaton, Daring Fire Eater, Spirit of the Dragonhawk, Blackwalled Pixie, and even Frostlich Jaina's hero power. I love the idea of taking a hero power mage in this kind of direction, because personally I don't really love the cards that they've printed so far, and to me the mage hero power, even with these hero power minions, just isn't really that interesting. So I love the idea of having a super expensive but super powerful hero power that you can use to affect the game quite a bit. At the same time, the idea of a control mage that has some sort of Sunstrider Waterboy combo at the end of the game, whether it be an OTK or just something that deals a bunch of damage, doesn't really seem that appealing to me. I understand why the best control decks nowadays have some sort of combo or OTK for them to win the game, but I prefer the meta to have control decks that fight to stay alive the longest. But I just think that's something personal to me. In reality, I think Sunstrider would be a fine card. You could have a 2-card powerful play, and you could also do some other shenanigans to get even more value from it. In an odd mage, you wouldn't even be able to combo this with Waterboy, so I don't even know if it would see play. You'll have to let me know what you think about this card. Personally, I think it's fine. Next up is Millhouse Tempo Storm, 0 mana 2/2 neutral legendary minion that reads, attacking with this minion costs 1 mana. And what's interesting about this card is you don't pay the mana up front, instead you pay to use the card. Every time you attack with it from then on out is just going to make the cost of this card more expensive. Maybe this was out the entire game and it costed you 16 mana for just a 2/2. The point is, with any good aggro minion, you want to get the best stats for the least amount of mana. And kind of like how Overload works, you want to get the stats before you pay the mana. But with this card, maybe you have to sacrifice some of the other turns by either not playing a 3-drop or not attacking with this minion. Of course, having 2/2 stats out on the board isn't just for attacking. You can taunt this minion up or use its board space to buff another one of your other cards, and it can still be useful, especially for 0 mana. I think it would be a super powerful card in aggro and maybe even tempo decks. Most of the time, you're only going to attack with this once, maybe twice, this, and you may end up just using extra mana that you wouldn't use anyways. The benefits far outweigh the negatives of this card, and I think getting the stats out there quickly would benefit a lot of aggressive decks. I'm a little on edge with this card, but regardless, I think it's an interesting design. Next up is Light Wisp, 1 mana 1/2 priest elemental that reads, after another minion survives damage, restore 1 health to it. So I think this is a pretty interesting effect because it applies to minions on both sides of the board. If you play Light Wisp and attack one of your minions into your opponent's, then if both minions survive, both are going to restore 1 health. This card not only encourages you to trade and kill into enemy minions, but also on your opponent's turn, they can use this effect to try to make trades that will give themselves an advantage. And that's why I think Light Wisp would actually be a great spirit. I wasn't really a fan of spirits when they were revealed for Rastakhan's Rumble, but since I've been able to play them, it's been really interesting having minions out on the board that usually do some sort of powerful effect and have that stealth for 1 turn where your opponent likely isn't going to be able to get rid of it. You could make this a 0/3, give it that stealth for 1 turn. I think it would be really interesting to see how the player used it and then how their opponent used it on their turn. It's one of those cards where because you have the choice of playing it, you can definitely give yourself an advantage. Make a trade that kills your opponent but doesn't kill your minion. But on your opponent's very next turn, they could find a play that also helps them out. At such a cheap cost, I think with the stealth, it could be a really fun card. And if you wanted to go really crazy, you could also play this with Akanai Phantasm. That could be a pretty interesting turn. Next up is the King's Wings, 5 mana 4/4 neutral dragon with the battle cry, if you're holding a dragon, discover a Death Knight card. Lich King is rotating out soon, and I think they did a really good job of balancing the Death Knight cards to make them powerful but also pretty situational. With this card you have to have dragon synergies, so you have to hit that critical number of dragons in your deck. But the actual effect of this card is pretty insane. Being able to discover or choose between 3 of them takes out the whole situational aspect of the card. There's a decent chance you're going to be able to choose it. Definitely better than random. And yeah, it is 5 mana for a 4/4, but clearly the Death Knight card is well worth it. I think because there is an established deck that could use this right away, it may be too strong of a card. I think it would be interesting if there was a dragon synergy where instead of a battle cry, it was a death rattle. So upon playing this card, you don't get that Death Knight value right away, and it also doesn't matter if you're holding a dragon or not. Only upon its death would the game check if you had a dragon in your hand, and then it would reward you with this discovery. Now it doesn't really make sense to discover when it's your opponent's turn, so maybe it would happen at the start of your turn. But whether making this a death rattle, getting rid of the discover, or making the stats a little bit weaker, I think nerfing this card just a little bit would make it more fair and not bring Odd Warrior to an unstoppable tier. Maybe you could also make this a legendary. Next up is Wallbreaker, 4 mana 2/4 paladin weapon that deals double damage to enemies with armor or taunt. So 4 mana for a 2/4 is pretty great considering the effect of this card. You get double the damage value when you're attacking taunt minions. On top of that, if you're playing something like a druid that has 20 armor by turn 6, then you can even go face with Wallbreaker and get twice the value. There are a couple cards that could buff this so that you could deal 6 or 8 damage, but I think mostly this would be used on its own, simply as board removal. I like the card, it has its purpose. I think it would only work in metas like right now that do run a lot of taunts. Next up is Planning Ahead, 1 mana warrior spell that deals 1 damage to the next 3 minions played. So this card synergizes with Warrior's own minions that get some sort of buff when they take damage, previously known as Enrage, which for some reason they changed, but it also works pretty well with enemy minions. It completely discourages your opponent from playing any 1 health minions, and anything that they do play is gonna take some damage. Maybe they don't think that's a problem if they play the Lich King, but for you, a damaged Lich King means you can use Execute. The biggest drawback of this card is that you have to play a 1 mana spell in your deck. If you have certain minions that already synergize this card, then maybe I could see this working, but in terms of enemy minions, it's not going to be all that useful. Spreading out just 3 damage between 3 different minions isn't really going to do a lot of damage, and that's kind of the point of using it with your own minions. It's a really interesting card. I would love to see how people would use this in their decks. I don't think it would necessarily be competitive, but a good idea nonetheless. And last up, we have the weekly custom Hearthstone design competition. This week the requirement was to design the card that adds uncollectible cards to your hand. Cards like Witchwood Apple, Marsh Queen, and even Deathstalker Rexar's Hero Power all create cards that you can't actually put in your deck. And I like this idea, but I did kind of break the rules with my card design. I present to you Nightmare Fuel, 6 mana warlock spell that corrupts every minion and adds a Cthulhu to your hand with the combined stats of all minions that died from corruption. So yes, Cthulhu is a card that you can put in your deck. It's not uncollectible, but you know what? I'm not actually submitting this to the competition, so I can do what I want. The corrupt effect isn't really that powerful. In fact, I would probably recommend using this card when you yourself have a pretty big board. It's not really about the board clear, it's more about the Cthulhu possibilities. Then when you go to your opponent's turn, they still have a choice of how to deal with yours and their corrupted minions. They can make as many trades as they want to, but ultimately at the end of the turn, any minions that die from corruption are gonna buff a Cthulhu that you then have in your hand. And honestly, corruption is really bad, so I think a lot of the time, you wouldn't actually buff your Cthulhu a lot. It's one of those cards where, yeah, if you're winning out on board, you could definitely get some crazy value for this. But in a more evenly matched game, I'd be surprised if you end up buffing your Cthulhu at all. You may end up just getting a 10 mana 6/6 that deals 6 random damage. It's hard to tell whether this card would be worth playing. Corrupting Mist is so bad and it's only a 2 mana spell. On the other hand, a 6 mana spell that gives you Cthulhu might almost be worth it on its own. I think this card could be absolutely insane and wild with all of the other Cthulhu buffs, but in Standard I would love a way to somehow get Cthulhu in your hand and have it be a powerful play rather than a whole deck built around it. Let me know what you think about my card design. If you want to design your own cards, information is in the description. That is all for this episode. Check out my series of misunderstood cards if you haven't yet. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, ta-ta.